Before starting, I would like to give you some information about this session. We have at the moment 130 persons online, so a very large number of persons in connection at the moment. We would like to see your active participation, so feel free to interact with our panelists using the Q&A functionality that you can find at the bottom of your screen. I remember that we are recording this seminar, so you will find it as soon as possible on a new platform that we are going to launch. But we are also online at the moment on Facebook, thanks to Confronti magazine and study center, who is hosting us. Thank you for all your work. So that's it, and I think that we can start our seminar. So Professor Ferrari, the floor is yours.
Yeah, okay, thanks Ilaria. I'm very glad to introduce this seminar on the behalf of all the pre-med staff of the Insubria University. As maybe you know, pre-med is an inter-university project that is founded by the Italian Ministry of the University, and that has the aims to foster the cooperation between 12 Italian universities and 10 universities of the Organization of the Islamic Cooperation. And the topic of this pre-med project is to investigate the role of religions in the dialogue between the two Mediterranean shores. So a very wide project with cultural, economical, political implications. And the series that start today would like to offer a sort of concise but very deep insight in what we think that are very crucial topics in the Mediterranean today. And the topic that we have selected for the first seminar today is a very central and delicate issue from many different perspectives. And I really thanks of the panelists. And so after this brief introduction, I would like to thank the moderator of today, that is Professor Barbara Pozzo, that is the Dean of the Law Department of the University of Insubria in Como. And she's also the director of the UNESCO Chair on Gender Equality and Women's Rights in the Multicultural Society. So is a person that in her studies focus on exactly on the topics of this seminar, and I hope you can enjoy it. And thanks again that have a nice and lively discussion and debate. And good evening and see you later.
Thank you very much, Alessandro. Good evening. I am Barbara Pozzo. I am very, very glad and honored to chair this panel and to inaugurate this series of webinars. I am also very pleased to have such distinguished speakers tonight. I will introduce them one by one. And the first speaker is going to be Professor Debora Spini of the New York University in Shanghai. Professor Debora Spini is a political scientist. She has published essays in English and Italian on democracy and globalization, human rights, and European identity. She has focused on issues like civil society in the globalized work, democratic legitimacy, European identity, religion, politics, and in public space. So tonight she will speak about the democracy gap, religion and populism in a gender perspective. Thank you very much, Professor Spini, to be with us, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much. It is indeed for me a great pleasure and a great honor. I have somehow, I hope I'm not disappointing anyone, but it so happens that I'm not a political scientist. I'm just a political theorist, And I think I have to say that because, very often political scientists, they kind of say, those political theorists are those that, just make fuzzy ideas and fuzzy speeches. Very well. All right. I would say that first of all, it's important for me to clarify what I'm going to say, most likely. will apply essentially to the northern part of the Mediterranean. Because as a matter of fact, at the moment, my research is essentially focused on Europe. I think perhaps, something that I would like to share with you this evening is some general consideration, I would say, on citizenship and gender, and then also how does it apply exactly to the topic that Professor Pozzo was mentioning, that is populism, and also how does populism use religion, and how does populism mobilizes the category of gender. First of all, I would like to begin by perhaps 5 minutes of general introduction, also to clarify that here we have before us a major issue, that is whether religious identity can be a channel towards active citizenship or whether it represents an obstacle, upon which conditions, and also how does this interact more specifically with the dimension of gender. I'm sure that you can all perceive that this is a rhetorical question. Of course, religious identity may represent a channel towards active citizenship. And why? For a variety of reasons. We have many authors that can help us to understand why. For example, I would like to quote with you tonight one important consideration by the great Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor. Because as a matter of fact, as you know, Charles Taylor affirms that being a part of a religious community somehow helps to structure the self. Another evident reason is also because religious communities, somehow they are part of that soil, of that background for democracy that we call civil society. So religious groups, insofar as they structure the fabric of civil society, they do play a major role. They gave a great contribution actually in revitalizing democracy. Evidently, there are some requirements for this to happen. And the requirement is the possibility for religious groups to participate and interact within the framework of what we can call a pluralistic public space. By this term pluralistic, what is it that I'm trying to mean? I would say when we speak about pluralism in the genuine sense, we need to go a little bit beyond what is normally meant by multiculturalism. And why? Because, there are many different versions of multiculturalism, as everybody knows. In particular, I would say we have one version of multiculturalism that we need to question, that we need to criticize, to be even more precise. And this is the version of multiculturalism that somehow aims at designing a society according to the model that has been called the model of the tossed salad. What is the model of the tossed salad? If you imagine a salad bowl in which you have different vegetables, right? But the lettuce remains lettuce, tomatoes remain tomatoes, peppers remain peppers. What does it mean? It's a model of multiculturalism that essentially conceives of a public space that becomes fragmented and divided among different communities. This is not what is meant by pluralism. A pluralist society, a pluralist democratic public space is, on the contrary, a public space in which it is possible for individuals to enact, to perform, to play, so to say, but in general also to mobilize different dimensions of identity. And I would say that this is also another very important consideration to do whenever we speak about religious identity and citizenship. That in citizenship, many different dimensions of individual and collective identity needs to participate, needs to be called into play. This becomes all the more important if we also add the dimension of gender to this kind of general considerations. And why? Because evidently it is crucial to consider that a citizen, and in particular a woman citizen, in order to be fully active in society, will need to play on a variety of levels, and also will be able as much as possible also to operate a series of negotiation, creative overlapping, and also creative intersection of all those dimensions of citizenship. Also, in order to identify what is genuine pluralism, it is absolutely important also somehow to deconstruct a little bit both notions of religion and also the notion of culture, and most of all to deconstruct and criticize the often too hasty identification that is made between religion and culture. Not necessarily all that is religion is culture, and vice versa. Here, I do not have the time to enter in detail into this debate, but I would like, especially for the student, to point that many scholars are contributing to this debate. For example, I would quote Anne Phillips, who's also a scholar of law, because Anne Phillips has provided very important insights about multiculturalism without culture. And what does it mean? Multiculturalism without culture means a view of a pluralistic society in which cultures are not conceptualized in monolithic terms, but on the contrary, cultures are conceptualized as along a continuum, and again, in a multidimensional way. In simpler terms, what does it mean? It means that within every so-called cultural group, you will find, again, multiple dimensions of identity. So the members of one group may have one membership and therefore one identity in that particular, under that particular point of view, but at the same time being constituted, being constructed, subject also by a variety of other dimensions. To go back to what I said before, a genuine pluralistic public space is a public space that is, whose architecture is conceived in such a way has to promote this kind of multiple play of multiple dimensions of identity, rather than boxing people up and labeling people within only one dimension of membership, within only one connotation of identity. All the more important this is for gender, because as a matter of fact, as well as we know that very often women find themselves at the intersection of different levels of oppression, that is also true, let's say, on the positive side, that somehow women in the quest for active citizenship may also mobilize different dimensions of identity. And it is very important to consider that also religious identity can be one very important dimension to mobilize. Now, as also, I know that, you know, in this webinar, I'm also supposed to say something about populism, gender, and religion. How does it tie up with this kind of general consideration? Well, I would say that somehow it does tie up with those general considerations, so to say, a contrario. What do I mean to say? I would say that at least in populism, at least in Europe, we can see that exactly one crucial dimension, I would say one basic criterion, even better to recognize what is populism, is indeed the basic refusal of accepting pluralism. As you know, populism is a very elusive term. Very often this populism is used, the term populist is just used to throw in the face to any kind of political opponents, and immediately, one's political opponents are immediately defined as populist. Instead, I would like, especially for the students, to point out that there is a scholarly literature that provides us with very clear criteria to recognize what is populism. And definitely, one of the better criteria, at least I would say in my humble opinion, that we can use is exactly this. Populism is that political ideology that is intrinsically, how can I say, averse, allergic to the notion of pluralism. This also explains somehow the, how can I say, distorted connection the populism has with democracy. One of the greatest scholars of populism today, that as you know is Professor Nadia Urbinati from Columbia University, Nadia has many times pointed out that populism is in fact the distorted face of democracy. And what does it mean? That in populism there are some elements of democracy. For example, the reference to the people and to people's sovereignty, the reference to the people as the origin of sovereignty. But the point is to understand what is the specific conception of people that is typical of populism, because populism has a conception of people in terms of a homogeneous community that does not tolerate of any internal differentiation. And here is also where we can see the dimension of religion and gender enter into play. And why? Because the forced homogeneity of the populist conception of people, at least in the European case, I would say for sure, at least in the European case, in many cases, has appropriated religion. And why? Because populism, in particular, let us be clear and let us be more precise, right-wing populism appropriates religion because transforms religion into one dimension of a collective identity, again, conceptualized as absolutely homogeneous. Here, we could also open another interesting line of discussion that perhaps, who knows, we could also perhaps use more in the debate. That is, whether this notion of religion as a part of collective identity, as a part of culture, as mobilized by populism, is or is not compatible with a situation of secularization. And I would say absolutely yes, because this version of religion, as a matter of fact, conceives of religion just in terms of way of life, and basically pays little or no attention to the actual, how can I say, dogmatic concept, does not pay much attention to religion meant as a living faith. How does it interact with gender? Again, the crucial link is the notion of people. Insofar as populism thrives off a homogeneous conception of people as a community that is ahistorical. What do I mean to say by this ahistorical? It means that the populist conception of people places the people outside of history, as though it was forever the same, as though it was forever equal, if you get my meaning. This kind of ahistorical, unchangeable, immutable community evidently exists because of ties that are not cultural, that are not political, that cannot be explained by an historical narrative. This is why right-wing populism, in most cases, ends up being, how can I say, practically overlapping with what? With ethnocentrism. What do I mean by ethnocentrism? It means a conception of people, not in terms of demos, that is a nation of citizens, as much as in terms of ethnos, that is a community of blood. Insofar populism thrives off this conception of people, you can see how important the dimension of gender becomes, because in this case, women become a crucial element in the conception of this kind of ahistorical identity. And why? Because essentially the control of women, the control also of the reproductive capacity of women becomes the crucial element for maintaining this community that right-wing populism likes to conceptualize in terms of pristine, ahistorical, homogeneous, and pure. So evidently, you can see that religion and gender can be both mobilized by right-wing populism in order to construct this image of community. To speak a little bit more in concrete terms, all these, general categories, then they can also boil down to a very concrete theme. And this concrete theme, I would say, to mention a little bit the elephant in the room, no doubt can be summed up in one word: Islamophobia. In particular, I would say European right-wing populism thrives off Islamophobia. And why? Because you see, in Islamophobia, there is, first of all, the construction of us versus they, where, of course, religious difference is absolutely identified with an unbridgeable cultural difference. This is also what has been defined as racialization of religion. For those of you who are more into the sociological field, in fact, I would very much recommend to follow this link, because there is a very interesting sociological literature on the racialization of religion. But also, you see, the use of Islamophobia in right-wing populist movements in Europe also plays another function, comes in very handy, I would say. And why? Because it is a way to identify with the other with the capital O, in this case, Islam, a long series of unresolved contradictions within European democracies themselves. What do I mean to say? I mean to point out to the fact that somehow even Western democracy has not, how can I say, done all its homework in terms of solving the problem of the place of women within the democratic public space. Western democracy has a basic contradiction at its roots, because at the very beginning, Western democracy was born somehow as a community of man that would push women into an apolitical dimension, into the dimension of privacy. Women, as you know, somehow fought their way within this political community, but they have never been fully part of it. Now, researching to Islamophobia, and in particular associating Islam with the subjection of women, with the condition of inferiority of women, comes in very handy. It's a very, how can I say, useful rhetorical device. And why? Because somehow internalizes contradictions that are inside Western democracy and simply, how can I say, lays the blame at the door of the other again. So as you can see, it provides, how can I say, a very easy to obtain degree of feminism. And it is indeed a very, how can I say, sophisticated operation, because you can also see that this allows the appropriation of feminist values even by political actors, such as those right-wing movements, right-wing populist movement in Europe that historically surely were not at the forefront of battles for gender equality. The last thing that I would like to say is also that it's very important to see how the Muslim woman very often has been conceptualized, has been defined by those right-wing populist movements in Europe, because evidently the Muslim woman is always depicted as the victim. This is indeed a very colonial glance. I know that Professor Debora Tonelli, who's going to join us in a moment, will work more on what is post-colonial and decolonial, but let me at the moment at least, introduce the topic. With a very colonial glance, the Muslim woman is always depicted as the victim, and she is deprived by all capacity of agency. In this way, somehow, the values of gender equality become the sole province of Western culture, and therefore are once more mobilized in this, how can I say, mechanism of construction of otherness. That is the crucial, how can I say, point, not the crucial point of origin, that's not correct, but I would say definitely one of the characteristic weapons of right-wing populism. I think that by now I have exhausted my time, so I would say, I would ask Professor Pozzo if this can be enough as a first round, so as to leave more room to my colleagues and then also for questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Debora Spini, for this very rich report that is full of a whole series of insights. When you were speaking, it came immediately back to my mind the work by Susan Moller-Hawking, Is Multiculturalism Good for Women? This is only one of the many questions that we should face when we speak about multiculturalism and gender issues, gender perspectives. But I think we can come back with questions to you at the end, maybe in a second round. And now I would like to give the floor to Imen Ben Mohamed. Is Imen here with us? She was trying.
Okay. Yes, I'm here. I'm sorry for the technical problem, and I'm sorry, without the video it's more difficult to follow actually the intervention. This is the situation.
Okay, I am personally listening to you, but I'm not able to see you. I don't know if the others are able to see you. Is your video on?
I have a technical problem. I tried.
Okay, we can go on like
video,
that.
But it's just the audio. This is the situation.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so let me.
You hear a baby crying is also my baby, so the situation is a little bit.
Okay.
Sorry for that.
It's simply fine. And I would like shortly to introduce you. Imen Ben Mohamed is a member of has been member of the Tunisian Parliament Assembly, and she's currently a member of the Consultative Council of the Arab Maghrebi Union. She got a degree in international cooperation from the Rome University La Sapienza, and she has contributed to the drafting and the approval of the law for the elimination of all forms of violence against women. So tonight she's with us with a conference on starting from women, the role of women's rights in building a new Mediterranean citizenship. Imen, you have the floor.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you all of you. And I'm sorry again for the technical problem. And for the late, so sorry. So I will be really brief because my baby is wake up, so it will be also hard to give the speech, but I will try. Okay, so thank you first of all, I want to thank you all of you, the students and the network of the university and Confronti and University of Insubria and all the other universities. I was asked to talk about the role of women's rights in the new Mediterranean citizenship. And I want to focus a little bit about the concept of the Mediterranean citizenship, the combination of the word of Mediterranean and citizenship. For me, might look a contradiction. Many observe that the region is divided by border, institutional setting, and narratives. I'm so sorry. I don't know if I can.
Don't worry, go ahead.
Are you sure?
Yes, I am. As every mother listening to you, I am very sure.
I'm sorry for the students. Okay, again, actually, I want to focus a little bit about the concept of the Mediterranean citizenship. And I said that the Mediterranean and the word citizenship might look like a contradiction. Many people observe that this region is divided now by borders, institutional setting, and narratives, and cannot have a common citizenship. In the last decade, many Mediterranean nations have been and are still at the core of some of the most important social and political struggle of our time. If we look our neighbor countries, we see that the region still suffer from instability, insecurity, and a proxy war. And as you know, Libya and Syria are the main examples. Also in the rest of the region, many political and social groups and individuals are in the process of redefining themselves around the identity, inspired by nationalism, authoritarianism, religion, and cultural homogeneity, and even seek their own personal and social redemption through populism, or even through the violence and armed struggle. This situation challenges the concept of the citizenship itself and the idea of the cultural and geographical belong in the region. So what we need now, we need to define actually a new concept of citizenship and belonging in the region. A concept based in human rights and women's rights specifically. So we need more than any time now to consolidate our Mediterranean citizenship and our Mediterranean identity. And this can be done actually if we live in similar situation and with with we, I don't just how can I say mean just the south country of the Mediterranean or just the north of the south country, but also between the north country and between the south country of the Mediterranean. And with similar situation, I mean the concept of the dignity of the people and the dignity of human being, and of course not under the authoritarian regime, that people can have dignity and human rights. The need of the democracy in the region is a crucial need for the consolidation of the citizenship and the identity, and also a crucial need for the guarantee of human rights and in general of human rights in general and women's rights specifically, because the fate of women's rights is bound the fate of democratization and vice versa. The baby's crying, sorry. Women need democracy in order to flourish, but also democracy need women. It's democracy need women, I said, if it is to be inclusive democracy, representative democracy, and enduring system of government. And the empowerment of women and the establishment of gender equality are crucial for democracy. So we all know that democracy is much about citizenship, right, participation, inclusion, and it's about political parties, election, and check and balance. And the quality of democracy is determined not only by the form of the institution, but also by the level that different social groups participate in this institution. In this regard, the gender of democracy matters profoundly. So the absence of women from political, social, cultural, and economic life result in democratization as an incomplete form of democracy. Women have been under an authoritarian regime and still now instrumentalized in the political arena in the region and beyond. Despite their effectiveness and visibility, both historically and in recent uprising, women as activists, politicians, etc., still lack the representation in the formal political scene. And I'm not talking about the legislation here. Actually, in all countries of the region, there are no limitation in the legislation for women in terms of their active or passive participation in political life, or on the contrary, some countries in the region have legislated quota for women in the elected assemblies. That's why we see higher number and higher level of representation in assemblies of some countries like Tunisia, Algeria, and other Morocco, and other countries in the north and the south of the Mediterranean. And to reduce the gap, actually, we need, as I say, not just the legislation, but also, also legislation for the promotion for the gender equality. And this is still missing in some area. And what is more crucial in the region is the lack of the adequate implementation. Some kind of laws prohibiting discrimination on the basis of gender in employment, for example, or other political participation, for the political participation or the economic situation exist, but women are still less economically and politically active than men. So I'm more familiar actually with the Tunisian example. That's why, and usually when we talk about human rights and women's rights in general, the example of Tunisia is always present. When we talk about women's rights in the region, with the adoption of modernizing and secular code of personal status in the 1956, Tunisia was being an exemplary for women's rights in the region. With the personal status code, Tunisia is the only country in the region that has prohibited polygamy and guaranteed equal access to divorce to men and women. Women's rights was an integral part, actually, of the debate about the national identity in Tunisia after the revolution, especially. And Tunisian tried to translate political activism in the ground into formal politics by adopting gender parity law for the elections after the revolution, which required candidate lists to be evenly split between men and women, 50-50. That's why we had around 30% in the Constituent Assembly, and I was member in the Constituent Assembly, and around 35% in the Parliament in 2014, and now unfortunately 23% in this Parliament. But we had also 46% in the local assemblies, and around 20% of mayors are women in Tunisia, included the mayor of the capital, Tunis. But unfortunately, this high number of representation is not the same on the executive branch, especially, you know, the government ministries and the diplomatic representation, especially. So Tunisia was also enhanced the women's rights in the constitution. So it was considered actually the most democratic constitution in the Arabic world, in the Muslim world in these last years. And also with other bills, actually, the bill, like the bill of condemning racial discrimination, the Prevention and Fighting Human Trafficking Act, and the other important legislation. And also the president, Sibsi, revoked the 1973 administrative order and gave women equal right as men to marry outside the marriage, outside the Muslim faith. And this came after the Tunisian Parliament expressed support for women's rights by passing a landmark, and this is the important landmark that you said in the presentation, the landmark bill on domestic violence, and the law actually more general of eliminating violence against women, which introduced criminal provision and penalties for actors of domestic violence, and include provision to prevent child labor, sexual harassment in public place, pain discrimination, and political and electoral violence. Also in media. Also in media, I said. So sorry again for the baby.
But no. That is why we are called multitasking, right? Women are generally called multitasking because they can give an international conference and take care of the child at the same time. Don't worry, go ahead.
It's nothing to be sorry about.
Okay, thank you. So I mentioned some the constitution and some important bill that we voted in Tunisia, but also we had Tunisia actually adopt a national strategy for the implementation of this legislation, because you know it's very important to change the legislation, but without the implementation of the legislation, all rights remain in the paper. So we had a national strategy for the implementation of this legislation by trainership also for the judiciary and the police, and also a different campaign with the civil society to encourage women to appeal against the violence and to clarify actually the meaning of the violence in Tunisia, because sometimes women are even, how can I say, not know that they are victim of violence. So the role of the state and the government in this strategy and the civil society is also to clarify and to encourage women to appeal. And also we had the National Action Plan for the adoption and the implementation of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 in Tunisia. So this is some example actually of what we did actually in Tunisia. And Tunisia also is an interesting example for the countries in the region in terms of how Islamic value can be reconciled with a reformist understanding of the religion throughout a democratic and pluralistic understanding of the citizenship. It's considered as a successful argument. This can give also positive signal for other countries trying to bridge Islamic value and liberal democracy, or for countries that still take the religion as an excuse to limitate women's rights and the process of the democratization. Also, another point that Tunisia still face and will face, unfortunately for a long time, not just Tunisia, actually also the other country in the region, is the economic and financial discrimination of women. So the more women are independent economically and financially, the less are discriminated. And we are still in Tunisia suffer from that, and everywhere I think, not just in Tunisia. So we are still trying to work on it. In the legislation, different countries in the region have legislation about discrimination on the basis of gender in employment, but in real life, in the majority of those countries, there exists a gap between economic activity between men and women, and which cannot be explained by the differences between the education level. The main reason for the gender gap in employment especially are the lack of the work-life balance, the gender discrimination, the social cultural norms regarding female work, as well as practical issue as like the safety and the transportation and other example. And with the legislation, the economic and financial inclusion of women and the legal is contingent actually to their legal status vis-a-vis key factors of economic activity, access to property, and access to financial credit or financial service in general. I have like an information. I was shocked when I read it. So according to the Global Gender Gap Report 2016 of the WEF, the World Economic Forum, it will take for not the Mediterranean, actually, the MENA region. So all the, not just the Mediterranean country, but in general, the MENA region, 356 years to close the economic gender gap, making the MENA region as the second slowly region to in the progression in this how can I say the limitation of the gender gap. And this is actually so how can I say is explain how it's really important to work in it and to work more in it and to put women's rights in the top of the agenda of our all our countries. So what we need now, we need to work seriously together, more real cooperation between North and South, not just this, but also between the Southern country and the Northern country, because we are different countries and we live different situations, and we can actually, how can I say, exchange our experience. And more cooperation to reduce the gap and improve women's rights in the region by the adoption and of national plans and regional plans. For that, we need also real activation of the different assembly, like l'Assemblée parlementaire pour le Méditerranée et all this Mediterranean Assembly, la PM aussi, of the Mediterranean and put the gender topic in the top of the agenda of these assemblies and of the national country. So we need a project who is political and cultural and roadmap for the consolidation of the trans-Mediterranean identity and the sense of the belonging to this common space. And we need a trans-Mediterranean civil society and political networks to cooperate more and to exchange more. As Mediterranean cities, I finish, as Mediterranean citizens, I believe that we share a common destiny in all this Mediterranean region. And our common destiny is, however, not only to cooperate and to exchange, but also to build an integrated space where conflict can be solved through dialogue, and women's rights are the key of this and the key of our identity, Mediterranean identity. And with this, I will finish the intervention. Thank you so much. And I'm sorry again for the baby.
No, there's nothing to the story. Thank you very much, Imen. You have tackled a series of problems that are crucial in the understanding of the status of women, also in a comparative law perspective. I don't want to steal time to the next speaker, but I'm sure there will be a lot of questions on your an intervention on your speech. And thank you very much. And really, you were very courageous to go on and speak with your child.
Thank you.
Back to you. Okay, so I would like now to give the floor to our next speaker, who is Debora Tonelli. Debora Tonelli is a permanent researcher at the Institute for Religious Studies at Bruno Kessler Foundation. She has been invited lecturer in political philosophy, politics and religion and theology at Pontifical Athenaeum Sant'Anselmo and at Gregoriana University in Rome. She has been a visiting scholar at Columbia University and Georgetown University, and tonight she will speak about exiting violence, the role of religion. Debora, you have the floor. You have the, okay.
Thank you so much. I am really grateful to you all for inviting me to take part in this webinar. I apologize for my delay due institutional commitments, but I am really grateful to Ilaria Valenzi, Professoressa Pozzo, and Professor Ferrari for involving me in this wonderful project. So I will speak of exiting violence in the context of decolonial theology. As we know, Mediterranean area is inhabited by many peoples and by many millennial cultures. Each of them can tell a different story about this area. The weight of colonialism contributes to the development of different approaches to the social political issues. We are still dealing with the colonial past, and we see its consequences, for example, immigrations or the political and economic instability of the former colonized countries. My speech today will be focused on the role of religion in the public space. In particular, I will focus on the decolonial theology as a way to build a new narrative. And as you know, my field of expertise is Catholic tradition, but the decolonial theology, decolonial thought involve many religions and faiths around the world, and of course, the interreligious dialogue that is part of the colonial process. Why is it important to deal with inclusive citizenship in the Mediterranean area from a religious perspective? From a point of view, it is important because all religions contributed to the building of social values and behaviors, providing criteria of judgment, and contributing to the building of social imaginaries. in the sense used by Charles Taylor. And this is for believers and not believers. And during colonialism, religion, whether consciously or not, has often supported the colonizers. Religious dimension is essential to social imaginary. That is the basis on which the members of a society construct a horizon they take to be shared. So from this perspective, we understand that the colonial theology as a form of emancipation from colonial religions, that is of their value system and of their criteria of judgment. The critical role of the colonial theology influences both theological and political spaces on practical and epistemic aspects. The colonial means an epistemic terms, a new and independent way to think, new criteria and new paradigm. My purpose today is to analyze the role of the colonial theology as possible strategy for changing and as an open question. In particular, I will tell you something about the role of the plurality of narratives as a privileged tool of the colonial theology. On the one hand, I will tell something about its contribution to the building of a new and common narrative. And on the other hand, I will explore the decentralization of both center and peripheries in order to encourage their mobility. That is, the possibility that a periphery becomes a center and vice versa. As a center, I mean countries having political, economic, and military power, able to influence politics and economy of other countries. These last are the peripheries. And here there is a very interesting book of Professor Kamrava, Fragile Politics, exploring this idea of center and periphery from international relationships in the Middle East. It's very interesting. I will argue that the decolonization is a process and not a definitive solution, which implies the transformation of both the former colonizers and colonized. I am using the expression former colonizers in reference to the end of official colonialism, being well aware that it did not mark the end of other and the more ambiguous and destructive form of colonialism. This means that, from my point of view, the epistemic emancipations requires the rebuilding of the religious and the political identity of both actors, former colonizers and the former colonized. At the end of official colonialism, religion has often been the space in which colonized people have fought to build their new identity. And in this context, the interpretation of sacred text, for example, has sometimes played a role in the struggle for independence. And from this perspective, the building of a common narrative of the past can play an important role in the new social political asset and contribute to the age of between former colonizers and former colonized. And of course, this is in contrast with the idea that the history is written by the winners. Using the plurality of narrative for the building of a common narrative, the divergences is not a limit, but I will show you that it can be a resource. Welcoming the dialogical approach, the colonial theology requires the readiness of both former colonized and colonizers to dialogue at high quality level. The issue at stake is not only the reconciliation with the past, but the building of new identities and a new global order, and this can only be an ongoing process. Whenever we face theological and religious challenges, whether directly or not, this confrontation will influence the social political order. This is especially true in times of transition and crisis, in which the horizons of meaning are reconfigured, making it clearly difficult to separate religion and politics. Rather, there are some gray areas. In these respects, the colonial theology opens a space of thought, providing the opportunity to rethink the power relations. And on a social political level, using the expression the colonial theology interrogates Western paradigms and criteria of judgment, which in the past brought religion close to colonialism and imperialism. Political change goes hand in hand with a new theological thinking. Then the colonial theology becomes the basis of a radical epistemic change, which is open to the possibility of a radical rethinking of religious tradition and the political space. At this stage, it is difficult to foresee where this approach will lead us, but it is a way to introduce a new narrative and to imagine new kinds of relationships in view of a more inclusive Christianity, and in view of the growing of interreligious dialogue. We can imagine a different world and a different future. So far, I have used both the terms theology and religion. By theology, I mean the doctrinal tradition, the theoretical and meaningful basis of practice and beliefs. By religion, I mean a set of behaviors and beliefs related to the sacred, which are able to unify all believers in a single moral community defined as a church. This is the Durkheim's definition of religion, which aims to explain it starting from its social effects. Radicalizing their differences, theology is a theoretical knowing, while religion produces social effects and influences not only the community of believers, but also the public space. Its universality means that a religion has to take into account the cultural context in which practice and beliefs have their home. A religious conflict arises from practice and not from theological doctrines. These last are ideals to hide the real reasons. In some way, a cultural hermeneutic of practice and beliefs is at stake, aiming to combine cultural differences around the same theological meaning. A rereading of the birth and of the expansion of Christianity and Islam, for example, could be useful for building an inclusive narrative, balancing fact, points of view, interpretation, and purposes. In doing so, we could rediscover historical resources to build a common narrative as basis for a decolonial theology. A common narrative has to be the outcome of high-level quality of dialogue. First of all, the building of a common telling of the story, in which all the participants are on equal terms. In the colonial context, equality between colonizers and colonized is missing. This continues in the post-colonial age, as long as the former colonized is trying to rebuild its identity and its independence. It often continues to be under the ambivalent protection of the former colonizers in a subordinate position. For example, in North Africa. An important sign of its being recognized as unequal is in the fact that it plays a role in the formation of the historical narrative. And the opportunity to give a voice to those formerly colonized is a way to build a historical narrative that balances the historical dynamics and the responsibility of the protagonist. Of course, this could have a consequence on the political, social, and the religious levels, arising from the creation of a new perspective on their experience of the past. And the second, the aim of a common narrative is not to prevail or to assert right and wrong, but to achieve a joint result. Resentment and revenge are not the feeling on which to build the best future. It is not possible to change the facts of the past, but it is possible to change our perspective on them. By pursuing a common goal, it is possible to trigger new dynamics between former colonized and colonizers. In South Africa, for example, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, led by Desmond Tutu, did exactly this, promoting responsibility and forgiveness. Reconciliation does not mean denying the past, but facing up to it in order not to remain trapped in it. Fourth, to promote a decolonial theology, the common narrative should be the result of sharing facts, point of view, and interpretations. It means that any community has to be willing to modify its own storytelling in a way that recognizes the legitimacy of other points of view and interpretations. These 4 points show the interdependence between the former colonized and the colonizers. The colonial theology is a process that involves both actors because it requires a radical transformation of epistemic and hermeneutical paradigms in politics, theology, and economy. The prerequisite for dialogue is the existence of multiple voices and experience, each recognized as equally significant, in spite of the difference in role for all difference between center and periphery. Of course, the issue at stake is not the historical narrative in itself, but its role in the legitimation of various theological positions and the acceptance of new paradigms of rationality with their social and political consequences. With the official end of the colonial with the official end of the colonial experience and the growth of the autonomy of countries once colonized, the church has also rethought is a missionary experience. Too often over the centuries, some missionaries have supported the colonial and the imperialist enterprise, feeling empowered to make disciples of all nations and making Christianity perceived as the religion of the colonizers. The origin of Christianity is multicultural and polyphonic, to the point that it would be impossible to identify the cultural root of Christianity exclusively in any one among the following cultural traditions: Jewish, Mediterranean pagan, Asia Minor, or North Africa. For this reason, there is a need for a complex narrative and dialogue between cultures and between the center and the periphery. The interaction between theology, politics, and economy is essential to the colonial approach because any colonial experience involves all these dimensions of life and creates a specific idea of enemy. The colonial thinking requires a transdisciplinary approach. In different ways, these issues, the need of epistemic and hermeneutical understanding, a new relation between theology, religion, culture, and a transdisciplinary approach grounded in border epistemology show the complexity of the decolonial option and the need to rethink the global framework. So the implication of the decolonial theology go behind theology. Politics, society, and economy are intrinsically part of any attempt to change, to the point that we cannot imagine a theological turn without involving those fields. And for these reasons, the colonial theology is a long-term project, while formerly colonized countries have to realize their decolonization in order to take control over their epistemic independence. The former colonizers put up with it, and this causes attention within the countries of the colonizers. Furthermore, they are continuing to practice a sort of colonization, for example, maintaining the control of the economy of their former colonized country. At the same time, they have to limit the consequences of the formal colonization of the past, such as immigration, political disorder, economic instability, which is mostly caused by the absence of a full appreciation of the situation and by an inadequate decolonization process. The risk is the introduction of a contraposition between us and them. So thank you very much.
Thank you to you for this brilliant speech. So I would like to thank all the panelists, and at the same time I would like to invite the public to send some questions that I will then offer to the three speakers of tonight. You have the possibility of sending us questions through the Zoom platform. Okay, for the moment, I don't see any question coming. So maybe just in order to break the ice, I would like to ask something to all three of you, because personally, I'm a comparative lawyer, and I have been researching on the status of women in various countries. Let me see if there are no others questions arriving from the public, because I would like to give them priority, but I don't see any. I have this impression that in a comparative law perspective, we often meet situations where religious rules or religious institutions have been overcome by legislative norms that, at least theoretically, should improve the situation of women and of women's rights. I'm not a specialist about Islamic countries, but for example, if with India, the Indian legislation has abolished the dowry since 1964, but it is practically impossible to eradicate this institution from society, and a series of other variables have come into in order to even worsen the situation. So, like consumerism. So everybody wants a new car, a new motorcycle, a television, and so on and so on and so on. So this situation where the law is trying to modify in order to improve women's situation sometimes remains dead letter, in the sense that we are not able to implement the law as it is, and the situation of women remain in this sometimes a really dreadful situation as in India and as in many other countries. So the question that I would like to ask you all is what should be then the role of the law be? I mean, maybe we should much more focus on, instead of introducing new pieces of legislation, maybe we should much more focus on a law that introduces a new way of educating children, stressing on varieties of initiatives that should be introduced in the school, at the university, and then maybe even the most important laws are going to be implemented, because otherwise I have the impression, being a lawyer, that sometimes the law is not the best vehicle, the best instrument to improve the situation of women. Maybe we should, instead of having a black letter rule, introduce other devices in education, in schools, in other instances. Anyway, I don't know what you think, but this is, as I don't. Oh, nowadays, okay. Maybe Debora, are you going to begin to answer this question? Debora Spini.
Yes, with pleasure. And probably, you know, I'm the less qualified to answer this question because, I mean, you're a scholar of law. Ilaria Valenzi also is a lawyer. Imen Ben Mohamed is actually a politician.
Yes,
so, I mean, I'm just looking at things, so to say, from the window, okay? Let me tell you this, Professor Pozzo. I am also a voracious reader of Machiavelli. I know very well that my fellow Florentine Niccolò Machiavelli is not normally quoted as, you know, a reference in feminist literature. But, you know, I would like to quote Machiavelli for this reason, because if you think of the discourses by Machiavelli, you do have this notion that somehow laws educate. And I may be over-optimistic, but I'm convinced that somehow law educates. Because to a certain extent, laws sensitize, somehow, how can I say, they verbalize, they visualize, they make issues visible. It is true, I mean, that you quote, for example, the Indian case, right? The abolition of dowry. But also, let's just have a look at the whole Indian legislation on women issues. Because let us be clear, that very often, even in the case of, you know, the Indian political history, women have been used as a pawn, or rather, women issues, women liberty have been used as a pawn in the never-ending negotiation between different religious/cultural groups. For example, with the fact that there has never been an organic reform in the Indian constitution of the so-called personal law. And actually, even in the Indian context, this is somehow something that a little bit ties up with what I was talking before. Very often we can see that measures in favor of women's rights sometimes are the pretext somehow for, you know, regulating accounts in between different groups. For example, now it is known that there is a general, how can I say, story about the, I mean, a strong debate. And of course, I mean, it's an important debate about the triple talaq, but the debate about the triple talaq, in fact, is all part of a general policy of Hindu Rashtra. It's not motivated by a generous desire to improve women's rights. Second thing, I think that, you know, as you're also scholars of law, surely you know better than me that laws do not solely punish, but also, I mean, laws promote behaviors. And let's say this more active version of lawmaking can indeed make a great difference. Because somehow the possibility of having some kind of political rights and political defense is important, not solely for, let's say, what it does in facts, but also for the perception of women themselves, for the perception of women of themselves as subjects of rights. And I would say this is also important. The other point is that there are laws, but also there are policies. And I mean, there is all another part of lawmaking that is not solely in terms of, you know, punishing crime, but actually promoting behaviors. And, you know, in this kind of policy making, surely a lot can be done that also may also end up changing mentality. Evidently, there is also a kind of preparatory work you were quoting education. Again, I would say in this case, the role of religious communities can be absolutely crucial in promoting not only gender equality, but also the full participation of women in the social fabric.
Thank you very much. So I will try to collect some other questions because I don't want to monopolize the attention of the public.
Can I add just something about the question that you said?
Of course.
Yeah, just I want to give just some example from Tunisia, because, you know, the change from, you know, bottom up or top down is always the question. So we should to change the legislation to change the mentality or the opposite. So Actually, both are true. In Tunisia, you know, in the 56 with the personal status code, you know, how can I say, the limitation or the prohibition of the polygamy actually changed the mentality in Tunisia and changed the society with the time. So in that time, it was like, you know, is like unpopular thing that Bourguiba did at the time, and changing, like limiting the religion and changing the law, and actually something against, let's say, the Islamic rules, seems like very, how can I say, not popular at the time. But now, actually, even the how can I say, the religious sapient at the time and now consider that the limitation and the prohibition of polygamy change really the mentality of the people and the vision of the, how can I say, the reformism of the religion. So yes, sometimes with the legislation we can change with the time, in the long time and the medium time, the mentality, and also the opposite. And I finish with this.
Okay, thank you very much. And now we have some other questions. First question to Professor Tonelli. Why are you stressing only the political and economical over the most important cultural decolonial option needed? Debora, you should use your micro. You should switch on the micro.
Thank you. Thank you. No, thank you for these questions. It's very interesting for me because in some way you are giving me the opportunity to explain my perspective. I am working in Italy. This is a very important aspect in order to develop my job and my reflection on the colonial theology. It means that working on foreign books, foreign debate on the colonial theology from Rome, in some way, I can claim that the relationships between cultural context and the religious tradition is self-evident. And also in sociology and in political studies, we are able to recognize the relationships and the role of a religion as practice and belief and beliefs in the growing and in the development of a cultural context, even if you are not believers. But working in Italy, my personal struggle is for the legitimation of theological studies in a political and economical context. For our particular history, the idea is that if you are studying theology, you are a priest or a nun. And if you are a lay woman, it's very difficult to legitimize your interest in theology. And if I am trying to show the importance of theology as doctrine in the public, the role of theology as doctrine in the public space, or the role of religious tradition, even for not believers, in some way, I am risking to be involved in a debate where people are claiming that religions has to do with the spiritual aspect of your life. It is private, and if you are a believer, you cannot involve your personal faith in public debate. But from my point of view, it doesn't mean that theology as doctrine or religious as practice influence the public debate. They do it, of course they do it. So my personal struggle is to make more evident in Italian context that if I am recognizing the value, the role, and the importance of theological and religious tradition in public space, it doesn't mean that I am trying to control public political debate from a theological perspective, but I am just claiming that probably because they both are part of our tradition and our culture, they have something to do. And we are also seeing with this Pope Francis, that sometimes is speaking about political and economic issues in the public space, while politicians are not so active or not in the same way, or with or not with a long-term strategy. So this is the reason for my approach. Anyway, in 20 minutes, it was impossible to consider
yes,
all aspects. Thank you so much. Of
course. Thank you very much, Debora. I would like now to pick up another question from the public, which is for Professor Spini. How does Western democracy project women's exclusion on Islam? What is the mechanism behind it?
Okay, the mechanism behind works more or less like this. Essentially, it consists in the appropriation of all that has been the historical experience of women's struggle and the immediate identification of all those struggles, of all those fights for liberation, of all those fights to conquer right. Immediately they are identified with what? With Western culture. So somehow this becomes also a mechanism that, how can I say, generates a kind of double bind oppression of non-Western women, because somehow corners them, forces them to take sides, somehow either to choose their culture or to choose their agency as women, which of course is exactly the opposite of what a mechanism of empowerment can be. On the other hand, you know, this mechanism of projecting on the other the problems that are inside Western culture also serves a very interesting purpose, because, how can I say, somehow it neutralizes the critical potential of feminism, because somehow, how can I say, incorporates feminism into Western culture. This is also a mechanism of exclusion that works very well because it helps Western societies to completely disregard the problems that continue to exist inside Western society. One simple example, as surely everybody knows, you know, definitely Italy is a country that has a major problem of domestic violence. And this domestic violence has nothing to do with immigration. Normally, this is a violence that is, you know, across all classes, all social backgrounds in Italian society. And as Professor Pozzo knows better than me, normally is a kind of violence that is perpetrated within the family itself. So rather than denouncing the wrong structures of powers that still inhabit our society and are so visible, for example, in the sheer numbers of victims of domestic violence, it is much better to associate the oppression of women, etc., with another culture, in particular, you know, with whatever is defined as Islam. And this is how the mechanism works. Furthermore, there is also another element that perhaps it's also a little bit more complicated, but that I can only, you know, briefly evoke, that has to do with the identification between freedom and, how can I say, and commodification of women's body. That is, that essentially we can also see that in many Western societies, women freedom is simply associated with the visibility of the women body. And the visibility of the women body very often has nothing to do with the genuine fight for the self-determination and the sacrosanct rights of women to decide upon their bodies, which is a very serious thing, but is only identified with the possibility of exposing and, how can I say, making visible the, if you want, even, you know, the sexuality of the body. Now, evidently, this vision of freedom can easily be associated with the commodification of the body of women. But as you can imagine, this becomes a very easy excuse, immediately, again, for this kind of mechanism of laying the blame at somebody else's door, instead of considering what are the persistent contradictions within Western democracy itself. I hope it makes sense.
Okay, thank you very much. It makes very much sense. Thank you very much. So now I have a question for Iman that is Alessandro Ferrari's question, which is of course a very interesting question. What about the state of the debate about Colibet today? That is to say, about the individual freedoms and equality committee.
Yes.
Iman.
Yes, okay. About the Colib today, I'm not actually anymore in the parliament, but I follow, you know, the political debate in Tunisia, and seems that Colib, the report of, you know, Colib is not in the top of the agenda now, especially after the COVID situation and all the economic situation now. So seems that is not, how can I say, in the top of the discussion in the public debate in general, in the media and in the parliament. So seems that this is the situation, but I'm sure that, you know, 2 years ago, I think that when the report of the commission was public, it creates a very interesting debate, actually, from not just between, how can I say, Islamists and secularists, but also between the same family, ideologic family, within the Islamists as a Nahda party and other political party, and within the secularist, entre parenthèses, on va dire, how can I say, tra parentesi, let's say that.
L'abbiamo capito.
Yeah. Because, you know, the Colib is not about the inheritance law, but also about a lot of other important, actually, human rights in Tunisia. And the majority of the point of Colib, the majority of the political party are agree in Tunisia, but about the point of the inheritance in Tunisia, it you know, it was a very, how can I say, strong debate, and inside every political party there is the pro contra. So there is the people who are agree and people who are against. And even if we have now in the different political party, as another party, the official position was against the inheritance law like this, but inside another party there is a lot, is more, let's say, it's more about personal opinion in the political parties in general and the MPs in general. So they think if we have and if they pass actually the bill now in the next year, maybe for the vote, I think they will find a compromise. And this is actually, you know, the Tunisian tradition, to find a compromise, to find about everything. So I think there is a lot of voices are agree, and other they are not there. How can I say, they are not agree because, you know, it's not so easy to discuss about you know, Islamic how can I say law, not Islamic law. Islamic, how can I say, something with Islamic background is not always easy in a Muslim country in general, even if Tunisia are really modern country, but we still, this debate still create how can I say, a kind of polarization and kind of, how can I say, a little bit strong debate, but I'm sure that they will find a consensus in that, as we usually do. So I hope it will come back in the debate, public debate, and I hope now after the the post-COVID situation and the urgent situation of the economic field, we will come back to discuss that, and they will. I'm not anymore in the parliament and anymore in Tunisia actually, but yeah, I'm following. I'm trying actually to give actually opinion too. So I hope we will soon have a discussion again about this topic.
Thank you very much, Imen. And now a question, and I would say this is a last question because we are running out of time. This is a question to Debora Tonelli and Debora Spini. Secularization has revealed many kinds of religions, and now in the dialectic between church religion and identity religion, the first seems more in phase with universalist human rights. So the question is, secular constitutional state should provide more space for church religion, able to control religion itself? Who goes first? Debora Tonelli or Debora Spini?
Tonelli.
Debora Tonelli.
Domandone. I think that, okay, a secular constitutional state should provide more space for church religion, able to control religion. So, why? I think that in some way they are different and complementary aspects of a public square, and with different purposes. Religion, churches, have not to forget their spiritual mission, and they are able to introduce a different perspective in a secular state. But I think that responsibility of citizenship is part of the secular state, constitutional secular space. And I think that today the difficulty is the religious pluralism within a single citizenship. So we can be in a secularized state at the same time to have a fundamentalist, radicalized religious group and so on. So different levels, different religious purposes, different quality of debate. And from my point of view, a secular constitutional state has the total responsibility to manage the quality of the debate in the public space. And the dialectical between church and religion and the identity and the religion is so deep in the different churches that it's very difficult to find only one key to solve them in a public debate. So this is my...
Okay, thank you. The last word to Debora Spini.
Okay, yes, can you hear me? Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
If I get the question right, because it is a kind of a complex question. If I get it right, I would say something like that. It seems to me that the major concern of this question is about the manipulation of religion. That is when, religion becomes a way to construct an identity, and especially, how can I say, an oppositional identity. In this case, what can be the role of churches? Well, I would turn probably the question in this way, that in order to avoid the manipulation of religion in view of political violence, in view of, exclusionary political violence, in fact, what we need is not how can I say, a lowering of the theological intensity. On the contrary, what I mean to say is this, that a religious identity that has been emptied, that has been voided, that has lost the real contact with the dogmatic nucleum, that somehow is losing the tension towards transcendence, the tension towards an authentic spiritual and faith dimension becomes all the more vulnerable by mechanism of appropriation and political mobilization. This is why I would say in general, but this is valid for Christians as well as from the top of my ignorance, you know, I think perhaps this could be valid also for Islam. I would say if we want to diffuse, if we want to find alternatives to mechanism of manipulation of religion in view of violence, and these last days are giving us, you know, very, very tragic, very, very sad evidence of how these mechanisms are still, how can I say, still happening, and they're still very much in use. I would say that this work of, you know, preventing the manipulation of religion in view of political violence cannot be done against religiously oriented citizens, cannot be done against religious groups, but on the contrary, must be the battle, must be the common front of all families of religious faith. I prefer, you know, this term, you know, the families of the living faith of, you know, rather than simply speaking in terms of religion. So I would say, rather than using the term control, I must say that, you know, control is not a term that I have particular, how can I say, inclination, sympathy for. But I would say, in order to diffuse this mechanism of appropriation and mobilization in view of violence, this is a battle that, you know, democracy will win only by acquiring a genuine religious pluralism, and also considering that this is first and foremost the battle of all men and women of faith, if I get the question right.
Thank you very much. So now it's really time to thank all the panelists. I really would like to thank all of you for this very interesting and inspiring discussion that we have had. I hope to meet you again somewhere in the air or personally. And I thank very much Imen Ben Mohamed, Debora Spini, Debora Tonelli. I would like to thank Ilaria Valenzi, Confronti, and Alessandro Ferrari for having organized this very interesting moment of discussion and encounter. So I leave you to the next episode that will take place in November. And if Ilaria or Alessandro do not want to add anything, I will simply say bye-bye. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Ciao. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Arrivederci.
Arrivederci a tutti.
Grazie
mille.
Grazie.
Grazie di cuore. È stato molto interessante.
Grazie. Arrivederci, è stato un piacere conoscerla.